The shuttle broke through the atmosphere of Thrios 9 with a hiss that rippled along its hull, and the moment the craft pierced the dense violet clouds, the warning lights flickered. Mira Hale sat strapped into her seat between two alien cadets who pretended not to look nervous, although the tight grip each kept on his gear betrayed the truth. The instructors had called this trial straightforward: survive 48 hours under a no-metal rule. For most cadets, it was a chance to demonstrate discipline and reliance on composite materials. For Mira, it was something else entirely. She had grown up listening to stories about Thrios 9, the planet that devoured metal like a living organism, and she had wondered for years how severe the effect truly was. Now she had her chance to see it for herself. The shuttle landed with more force than expected, the shock slamming through the deck and making the alien cadet on her left, Rel, mumble a curse. The rear hatch unsealed with a sigh, and a rush of warm, mineral-heavy air flooded the interior. Mira unbuckled herself and rose to her feet, stepping outside the shuttle into a landscape that looked like it had been carved from molten glass and cooled mid-eruption. Obsidian plains stretched toward distant cliffs, and every breath carried the scent of heated stone and chemical dust. She felt the weight of the instructors' eyes through their helmets as they observed from a distance, but she ignored them. She focused instead on the strange hum under her boots, a subtle vibration that reminded her of a living heartbeat deep beneath the ground. The other cadets began unloading their standard equipment, chattering nervously. Most came from species that relied heavily on carefully engineered composite alloys, and each believed the instructors had exaggerated the severity of the planet. Mira watched as the first cadet set down a reinforced frame pack, the metallic clasps shining under the dim sunlight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the clasp turned gray, cracked, and collapsed into a small mound of powder. The cadet yelped in shock, stumbling backward as if the pack had suddenly become a venomous creature. Mira crouched, examining the powder between her fingers. It crumbled like dry chalk. Rel called out that the pack's support rods were failing, and moments later the entire frame sagged in on itself, the metal parts disintegrating as if eaten by invisible mouths. Across the clearing, another cadet tried to hold on to his multi-tool, but the tool fractured in his hand, and thin layers of dust began to peel away. He shouted in panic and threw it to the ground, but the damage was already complete. Mira had seen enough. She removed the few metal components from her own gear, fasteners, clips, a survival knife she was not permitted to use, and laid them on a flat stone. She watched them decay with clinical calm, the metal turning soft, then grainy, then drifting away as if lifted by a wind she could not feel. The planet was not simply corrosive, it was predatory. The alien cadets responded with predictable fear. Some demanded to return to the shuttle immediately. Others argued about finding shelter even though none of them had tools left to build anything usable. One cadet, a tall insectoid male named Varek, insisted the instructors had set them up for failure. His sharp mandibles clicked rapidly as he spoke, and Mira could feel the panic spreading through the group. However, the instructors offered no comfort. They stood far enough away to avoid involvement, reminding the cadets that the trial had rules, and retreat was not an option unless someone suffered a life-threatening injury. Mira adjusted her pack, which was noticeably lighter now that the metal supports had failed. She walked a few steps away from the group and knelt beside a brittle patch of soil. She picked up a piece of the decayed metal, rolling it between her fingers. The way it crumbled told her everything she needed to know. Thrios 9 didn't simply react chemically. Whatever force consumed metal here worked with shocking speed, as if the planet recognized the presence of the material and targeted it intentionally. She wondered whether microscopic organisms were involved or if the atmosphere itself had aggressive catalytic properties. She made a mental note to observe how pure the glass-like terrain was. If metal could not survive here, then perhaps the planet's most enduring materials were the ancient silicate deposits beneath her boots. Rel approached her hesitantly, rubbing the back of his neck as if embarrassed to admit confusion. He asked her what she planned to do without metal tools. She told him calmly that she would not rely on anything the planet refused. She would find something that the planet allowed. He blinked in confusion, clearly not understanding. She had grown used to that reaction. For most cadets, tools came from packs and kits, not from improvisation. For Mira, tools came from the world around her. She stood and scanned the horizon. The dried riverbed she had noticed earlier glimmered faintly with reflection, and she suspected that the sunlit surface hid shards of volcanic glass beneath the dust. If she could reach it before sunset, she might find sharp edges she could nap into blades. She slung her pack over her shoulder and started walking, but Varric stepped in front of her, demanding to know where she thought she was going. He argued that everyone needed to stay together, that wandering off was reckless, and that she would doom the whole team. Mira met his eyes without flinching and told him that staying in one place with no tools and no plan was the real danger. She reminded him that panic had never solved a survival problem in the history of any species. Varric hesitated, but he could not refute her logic. She stepped around him and continued toward the riverbed. She could hear the others arguing behind her, but she did not turn back. Her boots crunched over layers of brittle sediment as she walked, and with every step the air seemed to shift, growing thicker, warmer, and more metallic in taste, despite the absence of metal itself. The planet felt alive, observant, as though it studied her with the same curiosity she had for it. By the time she reached the edge of the dried riverbed, the sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the cracked landscape. She crouched and pressed her hand to the glossy surface. Thin veins of obsidian-like material ran through the ground, sharp enough to slice skin with the slightest pressure. She took a flat stone and struck a protruding shard, sending a sliver flying free. She picked it up and examined it carefully. The shard was astonishingly sharp, far sharper than any metal blade she had brought. She felt a spark of excitement in her chest. The planet might refuse metal, but it offered glass. And glass, in the right hands, could become a whole arsenal. She clipped the shard to her belt using a strip of woven cord, then struck the riverbed again and again, extracting pieces of varying shapes and sizes. She found potential scrapers, spear points, and cutting blades. Her hands worked with instinctive rhythm, each motion deliberate, each strike precise. She knew she had limited daylight, and she needed as many pieces as she could gather before she returned to the others. She did not know yet whether they would accept her plan, but whether they followed her or not, she would be prepared. When she finally stood, her belt and pack were adorned with glimmering fragments of glass that caught the fading sunlight. The shards reflected her face in distorted patterns, as if showing her many versions of herself, each one more equipped for survival than the last. She turned toward the distant figures of the cadets, who still argued in a tight, anxious cluster near the shuttle. She understood that the trial had not truly begun for them yet. For her, it had already started the moment the metal turned to dust. She began the walk back with steady steps, her resolve firm. The planet had taken her tools, but it had not taken her ability to adapt. She would build everything she needed from the world around her: glass for blades, stone for impact tools, bone once she hunted something, sap once she found trees. The planet refused metal, but it had not refused her, and she fully intended to prove it. Mira reached the cadet group just as the sun dipped lower, staining the sky with muted amber that clung to the edges of the horizon like smoldering embers. She could hear the argument still in full force, with Rel pacing in tense circles and Varric pointing at the collapsed gear as if expecting it to reassemble itself under sheer outrage. When they noticed her returning alone from the direction of the riverbed, silence spread through the group like a sudden shift in wind. The sight of glass shards strapped to her belt caught every eye, and a few cadets instinctively stepped back as if the sharpened pieces radiated danger. She said nothing at first. She sat on a flat piece of stone and placed the shard cluster beside her. With careful movements, she pulled one of the wider pieces free and weighted it in her palm, feeling the balance. The edges shimmered with deadly precision. The cadets watched her with anxious curiosity, torn between suspicion and need. She selected a rounded river stone, set the glass piece against it, and tapped the edge with rhythmic control. Tiny flakes chipped off, refining the shape. Every strike echoed softly in the thinning air. The sharp crack of glass under stone captured the attention of every cadet. Rel approached her slowly, crouching down to observe. He asked what she planned to make. She replied calmly that she intended to craft blades, scrapers, wedges, and whatever else the environment allowed. His mandibles clicked in subdued amazement. He had never seen a human nap glass before, and certainly not with such smooth confidence. Mira, however, did not consider it remarkable. To her, improvisation was not a talent. It was a requirement for survival. She worked until she had a small spread of tools laid neatly beside her knees. A narrow piece became a carving knife. A thick shard became a wedge. An elongated piece sharpened into a spearhead. Each tool held a glimmer that caught the fading light, and every perfectly shaped edge made the cadet stare as if she were bending the laws of nature. Varric finally broke his silence with a sharp accusation that she must have prepared the tools beforehand, sneaking them past inspection. Mira did not bother to look up. She simply slid another piece of glass against the stone, letting the sound of the fracture answer for her. Rel whispered that no metal could survive here long enough for pre-made tools, and Varric grudgingly conceded the point. Mira kept her attention on her work, refusing to invite unnecessary conflict. She had never placed importance on whether others believed in her methods. She cared only that those methods worked. The cadets grew restless as the light faded. Some shifted uneasily, aware that predators often emerged under the cover of dusk. The obsidian plains glittered faintly, but the glow gave no comfort. Mira examined her newly crafted blades and selected the sharpest one. She tested the edge on a dry strand of vegetation, slicing it cleanly with barely any pressure. The blade's precision confirmed her initial assessment of the material. Volcanic glass here was abundant, stable, and deadly efficient. She could fashion dozens of tools from it if necessary. She rose and instructed the cadets to gather fallen branches, dry fronds, and anything that could serve as handle material. Her tone brokered no argument. Even Varric, despite his earlier hostility, obeyed. She directed Rel to bring her thicker branches suitable for hammers and mallets. He returned quickly, surprised at the variety he had managed to find. Mira selected 2 pieces and began to carve grooves along the sides, fitting the glass wedges into place with firm pressure. She used strips of fibrous plant material she had collected earlier to bind the joints, twisting them until they bit into the wood. When she lifted the makeshift hammer, it felt sturdy, primitive, yet capable of amplifying her strength tenfold. With the new tool, she moved away from the cadets toward a thicker concentration of scrub growth. She swung the hammer at a dead branch, and the impact sent a clean crack through the wood. She broke off the split section and turned it into a cleaner handle, trimming splintered ends with her glass knife. The cadets watched her with wide eyes. Her movements were steady, purposeful, and utterly without hesitation. As dusk deepened, a low rumble drifted across the plains. Rel tensed, scanning the shadows for its source. Mira stiffened as well, gripping her tools. A trio of quadrupedal creatures emerged from the rocky ridges, their translucent hides shimmering like liquid crystal. Each creature's elongated jaws dripped with thick saliva, and their gait suggested an animal constantly prepared to lunge. Varric panicked instantly, grabbing a composite pole from his pack even though its metal core had already weakened. The pole snapped in half before he could raise it fully, sending him stumbling backward. Mira stepped forward, raising her newly crafted spearhead fixed onto a short shaft. She held it firmly, forcing her breathing into a steady rhythm. One creature circled to her left, testing her reaction. She did not retreat. She shifted her weight, angled her knees, and waited. The creature lunged with terrifying speed, but she sidestepped and drove the spear upward under its jaw. The glass pierced with almost no resistance. The creature convulsed, collapsing in a flurry of crystal-like shards as its body stiffened in death. The remaining creatures hesitated, sensing a threat they had not anticipated. Mira lifted a second shard in her free hand, making herself appear larger. The creatures retreated slowly, their bodies refracting what little light remained into streaks of blue and green. When they finally disappeared into the distance, the cadets exhaled in shaky unison. Rel hurried to her side, inspecting the creature she had killed. Its crystalline hide fascinated him, but Mira focused only on the practical value of the remains. She knelt beside the carcass and placed her hand along its ribcage. She could already tell the bones beneath the crystalline tissue were sturdy and unusually lightweight. She intended to use them to reinforce her tools and possibly construct larger frameworks. She used her glass knife to cut through the hardened exterior, and the cadets winced as the blade slid effortlessly through the flesh. She worked with deliberate efficiency, freeing bones and separating sinew that she could later turn into binding material. Rel fetched a large woven leaf to carry the salvage without being asked. As she processed the remains, Varric spoke again, quieter this time. He admitted that she had saved them all without hesitation and asked what else she intended to build. Mira looked up briefly and told him that her next goal would be to create stronger handle bindings and larger cutting tools. She wanted enough precision to shape wood into structural pieces and sharpen bones into hooks, joints, and stabilizers. The cadets exchanged glances, slowly understanding that she was treating the planet not as an enemy, but as a raw material field. When she returned to her stone workspace, she began combining glass blades with bone segments she had extracted. She pressed the pieces together with near-surgical care. Once attached, the bone reinforced the glass, distributing stress along the length of the tool instead of concentrating it at the fragile edges. The result was a hybrid tool, a fusion of sharpness and resilience. She tested it on a thicker branch and watched the bark peel away in smooth layers. The cadets were silent now, not with fear, but with dawning respect. Even Varric could not hide the awe on his face. She continued working long after the last color drained from the sky, stopping only when the first hints of night chilled the air enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. She stored the tools inside her pack, prioritizing those she would use at dawn. She instructed the cadets to stay close but remain quiet, and for once, none of them argued. As she settled onto the ground beside a low outcrop of stone, she allowed herself a small moment of stillness. The obsidian plains sprawled before her like dark oceans frozen in time, reflecting faint starlight in fractured patterns. She felt neither fear nor doubt. She felt only anticipation. The planet had shown her its teeth, and she had answered with her own. Tomorrow, she would build more. Tomorrow, she would turn glass and bone into something greater. And with each tool she shaped, the trial would bend a little more in her favor. Night pressed heavily upon the plains of Thrios 9, but Mira awoke before the first hint of dawn touched the sky. Her senses sharpened instantly, as they always did when she returned from deep rest. She sat up slowly, listening to the faint sounds around the camp. Hushed breathing, shifting sand, the distant crackle of cooling volcanic glass. The air carried a muted chill that seeped into the cracks of the landscape. She reached for her tools and inspected each blade with care, checking for chips caused by handling during the night. None had dulled, though several edges required minor refinements. She set to work immediately, reshaping the smallest imperfections with her napping stone. When the cadets began stirring, they found her surrounded by a growing collection of tools, all sharp enough to reflect the thin starlight. Rel approached her first, rubbing sleep from his eyes and glancing nervously toward the dark ridges, where predatory creatures had retreated hours earlier. He asked whether she intended to hunt again. She told him firmly that she planned to expand her supply of bone and sinew. Her tone left no room for misinterpretation. If the group wanted stability, she needed more material to reinforce her growing tool set. Varric joined them reluctantly, though his posture had changed since the confrontation with the crystalline predators. Hostility had softened into wary respect. He asked whether she expected another attack. She answered honestly that predators here likely patrolled in cycles, and she wanted to be ready before the next wave. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances. Mira did not wait for them to comment. She secured her spearhead on a longer shaft she had carved late in the night and stepped away from the camp at a brisk pace. Rel hurried after her, followed by the others. The horizon brightened gradually, washing the plains in muted gold. The crystalline carcass she had left behind had grown stiff during the night, its translucent hide hardening into a material similar to cracked quartz. Mira knelt beside it once more, testing the rigidity with her fingers. She could feel the structural strength hidden beneath the surface, and she knew she could harvest more bones if she worked quickly. She sliced away remaining tissue with her glass knife, revealing a rib cage composed of long, curved segments that interlocked with strange, natural symmetry. She separated each bone with the precision of a surgeon. The cadets watched in silence as she rolled sinew into tight cords and placed it aside. The thick spinal rod drew her attention next. When she tapped it against the ground, it emitted a dull, resonant thud. That sound told her everything she needed. The material was dense enough to serve as a hammer core or a spear reinforcement. She cut it free and examined the ends, planning how to shape it later. Rel crouched beside her, asking how she knew exactly where to cut. She told him that every animal, regardless of species, revealed its structure through the way it moved. She had seen this creature lunge. She knew its weight distribution. She knew how it had balanced on its limbs. From that, she had mapped its entire anatomy in her mind before she ever touched a blade to it. Rel's mandibles clicked softly, impressed. Once she had collected the bones she needed, Mira rose and scanned the landscape. She did not intend to rely solely on the carcass from the night before. She wanted more material, enough to build traps and stronger spear shafts. She moved toward a slight depression near a cluster of angular boulders. The cadets followed cautiously, staying close but maintaining enough distance to avoid interfering with her movements. She crouched low and studied the dust, pressing her fingers into faint tracks that curved around the stones. She identified the pattern quickly, a three-toed print belonging to a smaller predator species. She motioned for the cadets to step back and readied her spear. Moments later, a lean creature with compressed muscles and razor-edged teeth emerged from behind a rock. Its black eyes glimmered with hungry focus. It hesitated when it sensed multiple hearts beating nearby, but Mira stepped forward deliberately, making herself the closest target. The creature lunged, and she responded with a perfectly timed thrust. The spear sank between its ribs, stopping it mid-air. She wrenched the weapon free, letting the creature collapse in a heap. Rel let out a shaky breath while Varric muttered something under his breath, half in awe and half in disbelief. Mira knelt again, working on the carcass with mechanical precision. This creature's bones were thinner but longer, ideal for arrow shafts or binding support. She snapped each limb joint, separated the marrow, and set the pieces into organized piles. She removed the creature's teeth as well, noticing their curved structure. They could serve as hooks or composite blades when set in resin later. Once she had a full collection, she returned to the stone workspace she had created the day before. She placed the largest rib bone across her knee and pressed a glass shard against it, carving grooves with steady, repetitive strokes. The cadets watched in fascination as she transformed the bones into handled frameworks for her tools. She embedded glass blades into the carved grooves, securing them with sinew wraps. She tightened the bindings until they squeaked, ensuring no movement remained. Each tool she reinforced gained strength beyond what glass alone could provide. The bone distributed tension, allowing her to apply greater force without risking shattering the blade. She tested each tool on wood, striking with increasing power to assess resilience. When one blade cracked, she immediately adjusted the bone shape and mounted a new shard, learning from the failure without hesitation. The sun rose higher, warming the air until the obsidian ground reflected light in shimmering waves. Mira wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, but did not slow her pace. She inspected the growing array of tools at her feet: bone-handled knives, chisels, wedges, and composite spearheads. She noticed the cadets staring at them with the kind of reverence usually reserved for advanced technology. To Mira, however, these items were no different from what early human ancestors had crafted thousands of years before. The difference was simply that now the stakes were higher and the planet was more unforgiving. She continued expanding her toolkit by carving longer bone shafts into shaped frameworks for future weapons. She envisioned a set of composite javelins, each with distinct purposes: one for piercing, one for slicing, and one for delivering blunt impact. She told the cadets that versatility mattered more than sheer strength. The planet would not give them the luxury of relying on a single weapon type. Rel knelt beside her and asked whether she intended to teach the cadets how to make their own tools. She replied that she would teach anyone willing to learn after she finished preparing her essential set. Varek surprised her by volunteering first. He admitted that he did not trust himself to fight predators without something reliable in his hands. Mira handed him a smooth rib bone and a glass fragment and told him to shape the bone until it matched the shard's curvature. He followed her instructions clumsily at first, cutting too deeply and unevenly. She corrected his grip and guided his hand until he produced a clean groove. His mandibles clicked proudly when he inserted the blade and watched it settle perfectly. Mira did not smile, but she acknowledged his improvement with a nod. She moved on to Rel, who handled tools with more natural dexterity. She showed him how to twist sinew into tight binding cords, teaching him to secure the blade by alternating tension points. Soon the other cadets gathered around, hesitant but quietly eager. She instructed each of them with calm authority, adjusting their technique and demonstrating how to recognize flaws before they caused breakage. As the cadets learned, she continued crafting her own designs. She produced a long bone club reinforced with 2 sharp glass shards at the head. She shaped a curved scraper for processing hides or vegetation. She carved a hook for catching small scavengers that hid in rock crevices. By midday, she had assembled an entire tool kit, worthy of surviving far longer than the trial's duration. The cadets had never seen such resourcefulness. Mira noticed the shift in their posture. Fear had lessened, replaced by a tentative confidence born from the tools she had taught them to create. They began speaking more calmly, discussing strategies for expanding the camp and finding better shelter. Mira listened, but her mind moved ahead. She had already begun envisioning the next stage, materials stronger than fiber alone. She glanced toward the horizon, where faint plumes of shimmering vapor rose in the distance. She suspected those vapors came from the resinous trees she had heard described in old reports about Thrios 9. If she found them, she could use hardened sap as a binding adhesive, turning her tools into something closer to engineered composites than primitive creations. She tied her hair back, stored her tools, and prepared to head toward the trees. The planet had given her glass and bone. It was time to find the sap that would bind everything into something far stronger. Mira moved toward the distant vapors with long, purposeful strides, feeling the terrain shift beneath her boots as the obsidian plains gave way to a denser mixture of cracked stone and fibrous soil. The cadets followed behind her at varying distances, no longer arguing about the direction or questioning her motives. The tools she had helped them craft hung at their belts or rested in their hands, giving each of them a sense of newfound capability. She did not slow down to offer reassurance. She trusted that those who wanted to keep up would keep up, and that was enough. As the shimmering vapors rose higher into the morning air, she began to see the silhouettes of trees, towering structures with thick trunks covered in hardened layers of glossy residue. Their branches spread outward like skeletal arms, and the resinous sheen along their bark glimmered with amber tones. She approached cautiously, testing the ground with the tip of her spear. The soil felt soft but stable, suggesting deep root systems that held the terrain firmly. Rel stepped beside her, staring at the trees with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He asked whether she was certain the resin could be used safely. She told him that resin, regardless of its planetary origin, followed predictable patterns: softness when warm, hardness when cooled, and structural strength once fully cured. She only needed to determine how to accelerate its curing process in the field. Mira approached the nearest tree and pressed her palm against the bark. It felt warm, almost pulsing with internal heat. She traced lines where the sap oozed slowly from natural fractures, forming intricate rivulets across the trunk. She dipped her fingers into a droplet, noting its viscous texture. The sap clung stubbornly to her skin. She rubbed it between her fingers, testing its elasticity. It stretched, then snapped back into place, confirming that it had the necessary adhesive quality. She called Rel closer and instructed him to gather dry branches in varying lengths. Varric moved without being prompted, collecting thicker segments for future support beams. Mira took out one of her bone-handled knives and scored the bark lightly. The sap responded quickly, oozing out in a thicker stream. She held her leaf-wrapped container beneath it, catching the liquid until the makeshift bowl grew heavy. She stepped back and examined the sap as it settled. Its surface glimmered, reflecting sunbeams in shifting patterns. Her next task required heat. She selected 2 large stones that had absorbed significant warmth from the sun and placed them beside a pile of dry plant fibers. She struck her chisels together, and sparks flew into the fibers. It took several attempts, but a faint ember eventually caught. Mira fed the ember with careful precision, coaxing flame from the fragile beginning. Soon, a small fire crackled before her, radiating heat across the resin-filled container. As the sap warmed, it thinned and released a sharp, sweet smell. Mira stirred it with a carved bone stick, watching the consistency change. Once it reached a syrupy fluidity, she removed the container from the fire and allowed the sap to cool slightly. She dipped the stick into the mixture and waited. When she lifted it again, the sap clung to the bone, forming a thin, glossy coating. As it cooled in the air, it hardened rapidly, forming a rigid shell. The result made her pulse quicken with satisfaction. Perfect. She signaled for the cadets to bring her the tools requiring reinforcement. Rel offered his spear first, holding it with both hands as if presenting an artifact. She took it, applied a generous layer of warmed sap along the binding, and rotated the shaft until the sap coated the joint evenly. As it cooled, it transformed from amber fluid into a stone-like casing that locked the blade into place. Rel tapped the hardened resin skeptically, then gazed at the tool with quiet awe. Varric followed, offering his own blade. She reinforced the joint with precise, practiced movements. The hardened sap formed a protective sheath over the bone and glass, sealing the edges and preventing slippage. He lifted the finished tool, testing its weight. For the first time since the trial began, his expression held a hint of genuine optimism. Mira did not stop there. She began working on her own creations, gripping her spear and coating the entire base of the glass head with a thick layer of sap. The resin cooled into a flawless amber-like socket. She tested its strength by driving the spearhead into a tree trunk with deliberate force. The blade sank into the wood cleanly, without even a tremor of instability. She pulled it free and moved on to her next task, constructing a composite framework for a drying rack. She arranged branches into a triangular structure and bound them with sinew, then sealed each joint with warm sap. The resin hardened as she worked, turning the framework into a rigid, balanced structure. She placed several thin strips of meat from the morning's hunt onto the rack, allowing them to dry under the rising sun. The cadets watched her movements closely, mimicking her techniques as they built smaller versions for their own rations. Once the basic shelter components were ready, Mira turned her attention to creating a stronger adhesive for future projects. She experimented by mixing crushed plant fibers into the sap, forming a thicker compound that dried slower but produced superior binding strength. She tested it by attaching 2 rib bones at a perpendicular angle. When the mixture hardened, the bones fused into a durable frame piece suitable for a larger construction. Rel asked what she planned to build next. She told him that she wanted to establish a permanent workshop area, an enclosed space where she could store resin, bones, and glass without exposing them to weather changes. Such a space would also serve as a safe processing zone for future hunts and repairs. She instructed Varric to help her locate large stones to form the base of the structure. Together they arranged the stones into a rough semicircle, creating a foundation. She used branches for the upper framework, binding them with sap-infused sinew. The cadets worked together without protest, carrying materials and assisting her in positioning pieces at the correct angles. When the frame was complete, she coated it with a mixture of sap and ground plant matter, spreading it across the branches like a thick glaze. As the sun heated the structure, the sap began to cure, forming a hardened shell that resembled primitive cement. By late afternoon, the workshop stood as a solid, amber-tinted shelter with enough space for tools, materials, and storage racks. Inside, Mira arranged bone tools on hooks carved from smaller fragments. She built a low bench using 2 large stones and a thick branch, sealing the joints with resin. She sharpened a fresh glass blade and placed it on the bench, preparing for future tasks. The scent of curing sap filled the air, creating a warm, comforting environment that contrasted sharply with the harsh landscape outside. Rel stepped inside the workshop and looked around in silence. He finally told her that the structure resembled a craftsman's studio more than a simple shelter. Mira replied that survival required more than a place to sleep. It required a place to build, repair, and innovate. Varric entered behind him, examining the walls with cautious admiration. He traced a hand along the hardened sap and remarked that the planet seemed almost willing to help her shape it. Mira did not respond to that. She simply continued refining a bone knife, her focus absolute. As the day neared its end, she stepped outside and surveyed the camp. Spears, knives, drying racks, and reinforced handles surrounded her in organized clusters. The cadets moved with purpose, tending to tasks she had assigned earlier. None of them carried fear in their posture anymore. Their movements were calm, grounded, and methodical, qualities born not from confidence but from structure. She had given them structure, and structure had given them strength. The sky shifted into deep orange, casting long shadows across the sap-hardened workshop. Mira stood with one hand resting on her spear and watched the horizon darken. She sensed the predators waiting beyond the ridges, ready to descend when night returned. This time the group would not face them unprepared. She had built tools, blades, reinforcements, and a place to work. She had taken the planet's offerings, glass, bone, and sap, and shaped them into weapons and shelter. Tomorrow she would build even more. Tomorrow she would transform the camp into something that could withstand anything this planet unleashed. The night settled over the hardened sap workshop like a heavy curtain, but Mira did not sleep long. Her mind remained alert, sharpened by responsibility and anticipation. She rose before the cadets stirred and stepped outside, letting the cold air brush against her face. The camp she had built shimmered faintly in the dim starlight. Reinforced tools arranged by purpose, drying racks lined with preserved meat, bone hooks, sap-hardened frames, and a perimeter dotted with sharpened stakes. What had once been an anxious cluster of cadets, huddling in fear, now resembled an organized outpost. She tightened the straps of her pack and checked her spear's binding. The hardened resin held firm, glinting amber along the shaft. She knew predators would return before dawn. Their patterns had already revealed a preference for attacking during transitions between light and darkness. She gripped her spear and stood motionless, listening. A faint rustle drifted from the ridges. She did not call for the cadets. She wanted them to rest. She could handle this alone. Moments later, 2 crystalline forms slid from between the rocks, their translucent hides glowing faintly with internal bioluminescence. Their steps were silent, but their movements betrayed hunger. She raised her spear and positioned her feet, angling her stance to balance perfectly against the shifting ground. The first creature lunged, but she sidestepped and struck its flank, embedding the blade deep into its side. The creature collapsed with a soft crunch. The second circled cautiously, but she advanced with measured precision and drove her spear downward, finishing it quickly. She retrieved both bodies and dragged them to the far edge of the camp before sunrise, adding their bones to her growing stockpile. By the time the cadets awoke, the smell of searing meat drifted from the fire. Mira carved strips from the creatures and placed them onto the drying racks. Rel approached her slowly, sensing the tension still present in the air. He asked whether she had fought alone. She nodded and told him that she preferred efficiency. Rel's mandibles clicked in disbelief, but he did not press her for details. He simply asked what she wanted the cadets to do next. She instructed him to help reinforce the perimeter. She wanted more stakes set along the camp's edge and additional supports along the workshop wall. Varek gathered thicker branches, while Rel shaped bone hooks for new bindings. Mira oversaw each task, adjusting angles and testing joints. She refined weapon handles and coated new spearheads with her enhanced resin mixture. The sun rose higher, casting clear light across her expanding workshop, revealing the details of every hand-shaped tool and hardened surface. By midday, she had begun constructing a bow. She carved a long, curved limb from a flexible branch, shaving it carefully with her bone-handled knife until the curve balanced evenly. She attached sinew strands twisted into a taut string. She fitted sharpened bone arrowheads onto straight shafts and sealed them with resin. Each arrow gleamed with deadly simplicity. When she stepped into the clearing and nocked her first arrow, the cadets paused in their work to watch. She pulled the string back, feeling the tension of the bow settle into her spine. The arrow flew with a clean whistle and embedded into a stone outcrop with remarkable force. Rel stared at the mark the arrow left in the rock. Varek whispered that she had produced a weapon more effective than the Academy's own training bows, and all without metal. Mira lowered the bow without comment and returned to shaping the remaining arrows. She worked with steady concentration, knowing that the instructors would arrive soon. She wanted the camp to stand as proof of what she had achieved, not merely as a place where she had survived. As the sun neared its peak, a low rumble traveled across the plains. Mira recognized the sound instantly, the approach of an Academy shuttle. Rel turned toward the sky, shielding his eyes as the craft descended. Mira continued placing finished arrows into her quiver, refusing to let arrival disrupt her momentum. The shuttle's thrusters stirred the dust into spirals. When the hatch opened, 2 instructors stepped out, dressed in reinforced suits designed to resist the corrosive atmosphere. One instructor, a stern male with deep-set eyes and silver markings along his jaw, scanned the camp as if expecting to find wreckage. He froze when his gaze fell upon the workshop. He stepped closer, examining the hardened resin walls, the bone fixtures, the racks lined with preserved meat, the tools, the weapons. His expression shifted slowly, from confusion to disbelief, and then to something Mira had never seen him display before: genuine respect. He turned toward her and asked how long it had taken her to build all of this. She replied calmly that she had built it each day, piece by piece, using only what the planet allowed. The second instructor, a younger male with pale ridges across his forehead, knelt beside the resin-coated spear she had crafted. He tapped the hardened sap and examined the bone handle. He said quietly that the Academy had attempted to construct similar composites for years, but had failed to achieve such stability without synthetic materials. He asked her how she had learned these techniques. She told him that necessity taught faster than any textbook. The first instructor asked how many cadets she had saved or guided. Rel stepped forward before she could answer, standing tall with a confidence she had not seen in him before. He told the instructors that she had built everything: the weapons, the drying racks, the shelter, the composites, and that without her, none of them would have lasted past the first night. Varek added that she had faced predators alone, crafted tools for the group, taught them how to survive, and transformed their fear into structure. Mira remained silent through their testimony. She did not need praise. The camp spoke for itself, The instructors exchanged a long, quiet look. The older one removed a badge from his uniform, a symbol of commendation rarely granted during training missions. He approached her and placed it into her hand, telling her that the Academy had underestimated the extent of human adaptability. He said that the trial had been designed to measure resilience, resourcefulness, and leadership, yet she had surpassed every expectation. She closed her fingers around the badge but did not speak. She simply nodded. The instructors instructed the cadets to gather their belongings. The trial had officially ended. The shuttle's engines warmed, and the cadets began packing tools and materials. Mira walked through the workshop one last time, running her hand along the resin walls she had shaped with her own work. She inspected her bow, her blades, her reinforced spear, and her crafted tools. She did not dismantle anything. She liked the idea of leaving the camp behind as a marker, a quiet proof that ingenuity had taken root on a planet that rejected metal. She stepped aboard the shuttle and took a seat near the rear. Rel sat beside her, glancing at her with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. He said her name softly, then told her that what she had built would be remembered long after this mission ended. Varek, across the aisle, nodded in silent agreement. As the shuttle lifted off, Mira watched through the small window as the camp shrank below, surrounded by shimmering plains of volcanic glass and the towering resin trees. The world looked harsh, yet she felt no hostility toward it. She had taken its challenges and shaped them into structure. The planet had tested her, resisted her tools, devoured metal, and she had responded with creation. The instructors spoke quietly at the front of the shuttle, but she did not listen. Her focus drifted inward, settling on the calm certainty that had guided her throughout the trial. She had come to Thrios 9 with nothing the planet accepted, but she had left it with tools, structure, and strength born from the world itself. When the shuttle pierced the violet cloud layer and the planet disappeared beneath her, she allowed herself a single, quiet breath of satisfaction. She had not just survived the trial, she had mastered it.